Video game film adaptations have a bad track record, with most failing to either please critics, satisfy fans, or make a profit. Many do all three at once. But there's no bigger, stranger, or more financially successful video game adaptation series than Resident Evil. These days, video games are being adapted faster than ever, looking to expand game franchises into multimedia juggernauts. But this wasn't always the case, and with the success of the original Resident Evil and the formation of survival horror, Shinji Mikami and Capcom's game was on the fast track to live action. But the journey to the screen would mutate the idea of Resident Evil like a bad case of the G-Virus. In this retrospective, we'll detail the live-action journey that Resident Evil took through multiple incarnations on the big and small screen, journeying away from its source material, back to its beginning, and then further away than ever, in an effort to understand what makes it so difficult to adapt this franchise, and why Paul W.S. Anderson and Milla Jovovich's films actually kinda rule. And now, let's enter the survival horror on film.
I'll give you stars!
Shortly after the success of the original Resident Evil in 1996, Capcom's franchise attracted the attention of movie studios looking to capitalize on the new wave of video game movie adaptations. There hadn't been many at this point, but Super Mario Bros., Double Dragon, Street Fighter, and Mortal Kombat had all leapt from cartridge to film reel for varying box office returns. And in December 1996, Constantin Films had purchased the rights to Resident Evil, with the plan to start filming their adaptation by the end of 1997. Earlier this month, I detailed the history of George Romero nearly making his version of RE on film, and what led to his fairly faithful version to never be shot. So I won't detail that here. So we'll jump forward in time to the year 2000, where multiple drafts and disagreements with Constantin's leaders led to Romero leaving the project and his version being completely scrapped. After Romero's departure, director Jamie Blanks of Urban Legend and Valentine was brought on board for a story focused on stars fighting the Raccoon City outbreak, adapting RE2 and 3, but the project never made much progress and Blanks quickly departed. Meanwhile, Paul W.S. Anderson, whose Mortal Kombat movie in 1995 had been the most financially successful video game adaptation up to this point, and a movie I think is pretty fun, had been writing his own unlicensed adaptation of RE, titled Undread. But when Constantin learned of Anderson's work, they decided to hire him on for the official adaptation due to his previous success and pre-existing interest in the franchise. "I'm a huge fan of the Resident Evil games and have played all of them," said Anderson. "The most interesting part of the video game is when you take that scary concept and you take it down into the secret laboratory beneath the Gothic mansion, which was very high-tech. It was that juxtaposition of horror movie with science fiction movie. As a die-hard fan, I wanted a movie version that is respectful of it, builds on its premise, and delivers on its promise. To be scary, you have to be unpredictable, and that's why I wanted to use a set of fresh characters. We couldn't use the Jill Valentine character from the first game, for example, as the fans would know she wasn't going to be killed because she pops up in the later games. The suspense dynamic of who is going to live, who is going to die, and what people's allegiances are was only going to work with new characters. Evolving from Anderson's Undread script, the movie that was originally titled Resident Evil Ground Zero, get out of here big boss, doesn't adapt any of the games, but taken on its own, can function as a prequel to them, detailing the outbreak that led to that fateful night in the Spencer Mansion if you fudge some of the details. Obviously, future sequels fully define this as its own continuity, but I think it's kind of fun seeing this as a secret part of the video game story. Here, Anderson's movie opens with a mysterious outbreak at Umbrella's Hive facility, before cutting to Milla Jovovich's amnesiac character, waking up and searching the mansion for answers before an Umbrella strike team breaks in and takes us underground. Flashy action, quick cuts, a driving nu metal score, Anderson's first RE movie is as focused on action as horror. Really, it's the few quiet moments that we spend in the empty mansion that are the most classic Resident Evil of the entire movie, with the majority spent deep underground. And for a movie that we all know is about zombies, Anderson's film holds off on the undead for a surprisingly large amount of time. Almost to the halfway point. Really, it's the killer Red Queen security system that's the biggest threat, and is responsible for one of its best set pieces, the deadly laser haul that quickly offs several characters. And I think this shows us what Anderson's first film really is, a techno-thriller with zombies added. The movie places an emphasis on viral outbreaks, experimentation, and corporate lies. All things that are part of the games, but front-loads them. The original Resident Evil game was gothic horror first and sci-fi horror hidden underneath. But this first film adaptation is sci-fi from the jump. The zombies themselves are the classic Romero type, not just in the slow walking and bite infection, but in how they're brought to unlife with just a little makeup, most likely due to budget constraints. And for an R-rated movie, it's pretty light on gore. Some blood and bites, but not really graphic. The most Romero part of all is the film's ending. Closing this first movie with the revelation that the zombie outbreak is in full swing is, of course, good sequel bait, and a nod to the larger story of the games, but also has that sort of cynicism that underlined Romero's zombie work. While Anderson's movie, and the RE games in general, don't have the biting social commentary of Romero's stuff, they do take time to emphasize corporate greed and corruption as the cause of all the death and destruction. There's a lot of this first movie that's deeply entrenched in the early 2000s. The blue saturation, techno score, needle drops of nu metal, slow-mo to emphasize cool moments, and somewhat wonky CGI that's thankfully not overused. But it's also riffing off several then recent movies. Having your lead suddenly know Kung Fu is very Matrix. It's also a way to make Jovovich's Alice be half audience surrogate and half kick-ass action lead, with the character and viewers slowly discovering that she worked for Umbrella, but planned on taking them down from within. And the more she remembers, the more ass she can kick, with her fight against a pack of zombie dogs being pretty cool, complete with mid-air slow-mo kick. Alice would have, well, way too many retcons in the movies to come, but here she's a pretty straightforward action hero that fits alongside the characters of the video game. Prior to RE, Jovovich had balanced acting and modeling, and Anderson's film turned her into an action star. It was specifically the action that attracted her to the film, with Jovovich almost leaving the project when her action scenes were temporarily removed. I liked reading Japanese comics and seeing ninjas swooping from tree to tree, said Jovovich. I wanted to have that kind of control over my body, the kind dancers and martial artists have. It fascinated me. I had to read for a certain version of the movie, and I got the new rewrite the night before I had to go to Berlin to shoot. Paul had pretty much written me out of the movie. I was the damsel in distress that Michelle Rodriguez was saving constantly. The "look out, behind you" girl. So by the time I got to the hotel, Paul's very sweet producing partner was there with flowers. And I grabbed the flowers and I said, I want to see Paul in my room within the hour. There won't be any script readings in the morning. Then I quickly changed, did my makeup, put on a really low-cut top, and met for some script revisions. He said, "What's the problem?" I said, "Okay, let's start. Page 1. And I think this first film gets stronger as it goes along, creating good tension, especially as Alice and our secret villain remember everything and have a confrontation over saving Michelle Rodriguez's reign. Resident Evil was released on March 15, 2002, making $102 million worldwide on its $33 million budget. Pretty strong for a small production company like Constantin. Reception, however, was kinda mixed, both by critics and fans of the game franchise. By 2002, RE as a video game had been fully established, with 1, 2, 3, and Code Veronica already released, and the remake hitting the GameCube a week after the movie. Just enough games to fully define what RE was, but not enough time and entries to provide flexibility on what was possible in the scope of the larger franchise. Resident Evil's equal success in both the United States and around the world led to its cliffhanger ending, which could have simply functioned as a way to tie into the video game story, being quickly turned around for a sequel.
Now, those left behind must battle an enemy that will not die. What was that?
Following Resident Evil's success, Konstantin quickly moved forward with another movie, choosing to directly follow up on the tease of Raccoon City's outbreak with Resident Evil Apocalypse. Released in 2004 and directed by Alexander Witt, with Anderson writing the movie and moving into a producer role to have enough time to direct Alien vs. Predator, a movie I discussed in my Predator retrospective and that I think is not good. Unfortunately, Witt is just not a good director. And what's with all this blurry slow motion? As the only film in Anderson's series to directly adapt one of the game's stories, Apocalypse is heavily cribbing from RE3, detailing the fall of Raccoon City. Adapting one of the game's fan-favorite stories would make this a challenge for anyone. Ultimately, making this Alice's story makes it even trickier. Adaptations from any medium are difficult, especially when movies decide to just throw in fan-favorite characters without making them actually mean something in the movie. I think the pre-existing game characters added to Anderson's movies are poorly served because they all play support to Alice and typically don't have their own strong storyline, or any storyline that resembles their game arcs. Jill Valentine, played by Sienna Guillory, is given a cool intro that hints toward her past involvement with the Spencer Mansion, but isn't given much else. The same unfortunately goes for Nemesis, who is barely in this movie. I want to separate these movies from the games they adapt when talking about them, but Apocalypse is trying to adapt so much of RE3. Having an iconic character like Nemesis here begs you to compare, and while I think the monster suit is pretty solid, he doesn't do much. Nemesis wiping out STARS doesn't really matter here because what is STARS in this franchise? Nemesis is also more of a tragic character instead of just a threat, and then he becomes a good guy who's quickly crushed by a crashing helicopter. Ultimately, I think Apocalypse is a failure, both as an adaptation and its own movie. Overall, Apocalypse is better when it's dark hallways and creeping horror, and not when it's wirework kung fu explosions. The church scene where Jill and friends try to survive a group of lickers has good horror in line with the games. The series will push more into the action as it goes on, but how well that works depends on the movie. Despite this being one of only 2 movies in the series not directed by Anderson, it sets a lot of the template for the films that follow, like opening with Jovovich recapping the story in a floating screen, giving Alice T-virus superpowers caused by Umbrella experiments, and providing a new scenario and cast that revolve around Alice's story. Alice's superpowers have her outclass every threat. I mean, she fights Nemesis in hand-to-hand combat. We've moved out of horror and fully into sci-fi action. That's a very different type of movie, but I think Jovovich is actually really good at it. I like that we get a really huge zombie outbreak in Raccoon City on screen, complete with streets filled with the undead overrunning cops and the UBCS, but it never quite gets to the level that I think would be really effective. Still better than Welcome to Raccoon City, but more on that later. By the end, Raccoon City has met the same fate as the games, with Alice, Jill, Carlos, LJ, and Angela escaping, Alice getting telekinesis, and the cliffhanger that Umbrella may now be controlling her mind. It's kinda confusing and random, and I don't think it does the movie any favors. Look, I know I've said a lot of negative things about this movie, but Resident Evil Apocalypse ends with Killswitch Engage's The End of Heartache playing over the credits, and this is actually the greatest moment in film history, so there's that. With an increased budget of $45 million, Apocalypse would make more money than the first with $129 million worldwide. And while I don't think either critics or fans were happy with this Raccoon City set story, the increasing box office guaranteed more.
We fought the infection. We survived the apocalypse. And now, we face extinction.
2007's Resident Evil Extinction is directed by Russell Mulcahy, most famous for Highlander, and written by Anderson. And this is the moment that the live-action series and the games completely diverge. And the thing is, you either have to completely divorce your perception of these movies from what you expect in a Resident Evil game, or you'll just be angry about what these films do or don't do in terms of adaptation. So let's get that out of the way right here. When these movies adapt or directly reference the games, then we can compare. Otherwise, we'll discuss them as their own thing. And we get into full-on strangeness with the reveal that Umbrella has been cloning and testing dozens of Alices in a remix of the original movie's traps. In the aftermath of Raccoon City, the T-virus spread globally, infecting all life and withering the entire world. So with this movie, we're fully beyond the RE game stories and into our own world. Extinction brings back Carlos and LJ, but it also drops Jill and Angela without a mention, setting a precedent for these movies to drop more and more characters in the mere minutes that take place between some entries, without any explanation. Claire Redfield, played by Ali Larder, joins as part of a convoy of the living trying to find a safe zone. So this puts us more in line with something like Romero's Day of the Dead or The Road Warrior. Ian Glenn's Dr. Isaacs is the main villain here, but we also have Albert Wesker, whose direction must have been to sit as still as possible, talking lots in underground boardrooms. Umbrella has always been cartoonishly evil in the games, but it's not really that interesting for an ongoing villain in a film franchise. Also, I haven't mentioned it before, but these movies love a wireframe of an underground compound. I think one of these shows up in every movie. With Alice and company above ground in a desert wasteland and Umbrella underground observing, this is the first time a movie has two wildly disparate tones going on, but it wouldn't be the last. The mix of amped up effects on the undead and the hot climate sell the horror a lot better than Apocalypse. Overall, the action is really good and these deaths are nasty. This is the most pure zombie movie of the series, with a big cast of characters getting picked off by the undead horde. Near the end, Carlos and Jill kiss before a sacrifice. It doesn't make much sense in the relationship these movies have built between the two, but sure, why not? Two attractive people in the zombie apocalypse? Kiss. These movies are filled with hot people. Everybody should be kissing. The finale is probably the weakest part of the whole movie, and Alice gaining control of an army of her clones is ridiculous. It's clearly a development they didn't know what to do with, as is made clear at the start of the next movie. Still, I think that Extinction does the most with its zombie premise out of any live-action film here. They're front and center and really feel like a true danger. Lots of sacrifices, big set pieces, and a distinct look. Bright and sandy compared to the first film's steely underbelly and Apocalypse's sharp blue tint. Once again, the box office would only increase, with Extinction making $147 million on its $45 million budget. And while the end of the film tees up an even stranger battle against Umbrella, I think Anderson's movies can be seen as two trilogies, with this film's finale bringing us back to the first film's laser grid hallway, and Alice turning the tide of battle as the close to this first half. And with that, Anderson would return to the story he started. Debuting in 2010, Resident Evil Afterlife, written and directed by Anderson, opens with the Alice clones' invasion of the Umbrella Underground headquarters. This opening is easily the most insane thing to happen in the entire series, and maybe the franchise as a whole, with multiple clone Alices with psychic powers invading the Umbrella facility with tons of death, and all of them killed in a massive explosion. Then the real Alice is injected by Wesker with a serum that removes all of her powers. This isn't the last time that one of these movies will open with a hard reset, but I think it's for the best, because once the clone army and psychic powers are gone, this movie rules. Afterlife then switches into a much more low-key and somber gear, as Alice searches for the extinction survivors in the Arcadia safe haven, finds Claire controlled by a chest scarab like Jill in RE5, and together travel to LA for another group of survivors in a City of the Dead, as well as Chris Redfield, played by Wentworth Miller, who is basically nothing like the game character. The aesthetic of the movie is very grayed out, from the cold Alaskan wilderness to the smoke-filled LA skyline. It's pretty much the opposite of Extinction's bright desert look, and there's a sense of melancholy and desperation here. Afterlife also reflects modern RE games, universe, using the Ouroboros virus, the absolutely sick Axeman, and a superpowered Wesker, all inspired by Resident Evil 5. The Axeman is cool as hell. This entire movie is cool as hell. Fighting a legion of zombies on top of a building is fun, and I think this movie is really stylish. And instead of the typical ultra-fast cut editing, Anderson employs extremely long slow-motion shots that go on way longer than you'd expect. Alice's escape from the roof and the bathroom fight with the Axeman are both basically all slow-mo, and they linger on great choreography and cool shot framing. Anderson clearly knows that his action scenes look awesome and his actresses look hot, so he's letting it all play out. Anderson's RE loves a good needle drop, and the finale, set to a Perfect Circle's The Outsider remix, is extremely my thing. The all-white set is the aesthetic opposite of the rest of the film, and with even more slow-mo, I love the look. With Anderson's return, RE has embraced a maximalist approach, where everything is bigger, more dramatic, more insanely choreographed. The quality of acting is all over the place. But the way this movie has a darker undertone to its characters, while still being over the top in its visual presentation, really works. It all ends with the series' happiest ending, subverted by the arrival of Umbrella forces led by a mind-controlled Jill Valentine, once again utilizing RE5's iconography. And guess what? Afterlife was an even bigger hit, grossing $300 million on its $60 million budget. Cue another sequel.
My name is Alice, and this is my world.
Resident Evil Retribution, once again written and directed by Anderson and released in 2012, starts immediately after Afterlife, with the battle between Alice and the survivors against the invading Umbrella Force led by Jill, shown in a legit stunning slow-mo reverse. And so, once again, one of Anderson's movies has completely wiped the slate clean, before moving to Umbrella's underground facility that can recreate cities and populate them with clones, including Alice for outbreak scenarios. It's the chance for the movie to bring back different dead characters, including Rain and Carlos, as well as creating a young girl named Becky, who is Clone Alice's daughter in this imitation world. So what I think is important to bring up here is that Jovovich and Anderson started dating after the original movie, and would eventually have 3 daughters and get married during the course of the series. I think that this shift in their lives to being parents really informs the second half of their films, and it's really obvious here. In Apocalypse, Alice has some moments of protecting Angela, but it's not a major focus. Here, Alice choosing to become a surrogate mother to a daughter she never knew is the point of the movie, and even Clone Alice without any training sacrifices herself for Becky. It's a totally different dimension for the character, and I think it stems from Jovovich already having her first daughter at this point. With almost all of Retribution taking place in Umbrella's underground facility, which alternates between simulations of modern cities and gleaming white halls, this movie has style to spare. The aesthetic of this one is high-tech and clean. Bright whites and reds behind the simulation of reality. And while it leans back into Anderson's fast-cut action, scenes like the close-quarters hallway fight are really well done. Here, Alice teams up with Ada Wong, who's working for a still-alive Wesker, in a strike team that has Luther from Afterlife, as well as Leon Kennedy and Barry Burton. Much like RE4, Leon loses his cool jacket way too early. With another Red Queen spinning up new scenarios and unleashing biohazards, Retribution gets to throw zombies, axemen, plagas, and a super liquor at our heroes, with evil versions of Carlos, Rain, and One, Laser Hallway Guy, chasing after them. I really like how this story is both big in scale but also kinda claustrophobic. But there are some moments that it goes a little too big for the budget, and the CG becomes obvious. That said, the awesome electronic orchestral score by Tomandandy gives it this awesome feel that's both sweeping and high-tech. Definitely my favorite score in these movies. The surrogate mother-daughter relationship takes cues from Aliens, including Becky being abducted into an egg colony while there's a countdown to a huge explosion. The idea that everything in this world is a simulation, but that life still has value and the relationships created can still be meaningful, feels like a commentary on the value of movies, and our creators' decision to invest so much in this world.
It's just like a camera. Point and shoot.
So this gives Alice, who is trying to be a human and not a weapon, greater inherent value as she also connects with a surrogate daughter who is more than just a clone. Alice is the centerpiece of the movie, so adding new characters like Ada, Leon, and Barry kinda just doesn't work here. I get that the movie is giving RE fans a little something by having more game characters added to the series, but having them be these characters specifically is a little pointless. RE fans like them because of the specific stories they've been in, and how that's shaped their personalities and relationships. Vaguely looking and acting like their game counterparts isn't really enough because there's nothing about them that's related to their original stories. Likewise, the movies don't give them anything special to do, so it becomes a case of game fans not getting what they want, and non-fans wondering why the movie is spending so much time on these characters that haven't been established before. Having Jill be the main antagonist and bringing back a character like Rain work better because they've been given something previously in the series. When we're focused on Alice, who's forced through all these artificial scenarios and still choosing to value human life in the midst of it, the movie's at its best. It all ends on the biggest cliffhanger of the entire series, pulling back from the White House fortress to see a sea of monsters. What will happen to a newly repowered Alice and friends? Well, we'll get to that in a second. Retribution wasn't quite as big of a hit as Afterlife, making $240 million on its $65 million budget. But the continued success of the franchise led to Anderson and Jovovich signing up for one final film.
My name is Alice, and this is my story. The end of my story.
Resident Evil: The Final Chapter, released at the end of 2016 in Japan and the beginning of 2017 worldwide, is, as always, written and directed by Anderson, and has an emphasis on two things: gigantic spectacle and an extreme amount of retconning. Starting with the history of Umbrella, Dr. James Marcus, and the discovery of the T-virus to save his rapidly aging daughter, Alicia, which all goes wrong when Wesker and Isaacs kill him to take over. After the typical voiceover recap, we open with the giant battle from the end of Retribution already over, everything destroyed, and just Alice still alive. That's right, no giant battle, no fate of the world being decided. What happened to Jill, Leon, Ada, and Becky? Well, they're just gone and we're supposed to assume they're dead. But it's never actually said. And I think that's a terrible way to start this movie. It's very clear that while each of these movies set up something for the next one, Anderson and company didn't really have a plan for what comes next. Now, I don't think that every movie franchise needs an exact roadmap for their sequels to be good, but when each of these movies basically erases the status quo set up by the end of the last, it can be really tiring. The dissonance between the end of Retribution and the start of the final chapter is the worst example of this. And in the novelization, we find out that Jill, Leon, and Ada were all squished by a blobby thing called the melange, and that Becky was hidden during the attack and ultimately survived. In the movie, they're never mentioned, making room for a new cast of characters that I think are all very boring. And also the return of Claire, who's solidified as the second most important character of the series here. Chris? Chris who? Cue a story that takes Alice back to the Raccoon City hive to find an airborne T-virus antidote that will save the remaining humans, pitting her against Wesker and the still-alive Dr. Isaacs, a religious zealot with lots of clone shenanigans. The aesthetic this time is bombed-out wasteland, and unfortunately, just not as interesting looking as previous movies. There is, however, a lot of enormous set pieces like a giant castle siege, but I think this battle, like a lot of this movie, is just a little too aesthetically indiscriminate. But it's also well directed and has huge bombast. This is the biggest spectacle of the entire movie franchise, so that makes up for it lacking a distinct visual identity like the rest of these movies. But even a return to the hive is a little too visually bland. Unfortunately, filming the final chapter also caused two horrible accidents on set that led to a motorcycle crash that caused horrific injuries for stuntwoman Olivia Jackson due to unsafe filming conditions, and a second accident that led to the death of crew member Ricardo Cornelius. This kinda mars the whole movie for me. Alice and the group's journey through Hive leads to the series' biggest retcon, revealing that Alice is a clone of the original Alicia Marcus, whose personality was used to create the Red Queen. Jovovich is playing Alicia, basically her mother. Her daughter, Ever Anderson, is playing the Red Queen and young Alicia, and Anderson, the father, is behind the camera, making this story into a commentary on family and female identity. Cue another laser hallway fight that loses a little something because they already did this in the finale of Extinction, but that plays into my idea of there being two trilogies here, and both have a finale that homages the original. Alice eventually releases the antidote and saves what remains of the world. But the emotional core of the finale is Alice, who has no memory from before the original movie, receiving the recorded memories of Alicia's childhood, essentially gifting her with a full life. It's a very sweet moment for these movies to end on, as Alice goes on to have more adventures. In these last three movies, we see that Jovovich and Anderson have focused on Alice's story. Really, the Resident Evil title has become unimportant. Not just because the world of this franchise is so far removed from what the games do, but because the central story is not about the horror anymore, but about this one woman and her journey. And the final chapter would be the most successful of any of these movies, making $312 million on its $40 million budget. In total, Anderson's movies would make $1.2 billion worldwide, making it the highest-grossing video game movie franchise, and one of the highest-grossing horror franchises in history. Japan in particular was a consistently big market for these, even with them clearly not having anything to do with Capcom's games. And China played a huge part in the final chapter's success, adding $159 million to the box office on its own. But now, Anderson and Jovovich's time behind the RE title was over. And after years of fans demanding it, Resident Evil would be rebooted on screen for a story much closer to the game.
We're gonna take Umbrella down.
With the final chapter marking the official end to Anderson and Jovovich's involvement, Constantin Films and chairman Martin Moscovich quickly announced that a reboot was in the works, actually letting their plans be known in early 2017 while the final chapter was still in theaters. Constantin then hired on James Wan, fresh off the success of the Conjuring and Insidious movies, to produce, and Greg Russo to write. And with Resident Evil 7 released the same year and reinvigorating the franchise, Russo proposed making a movie that was a direct sequel to the game starring Ethan and Mia Winters. Constantin felt that the game was too new and declined, then proposed a time travel story, which led to Wan and Russo leaving the project, which, I mean, I get it. At the end of 2018, Johannes Roberts was hired to write and direct the reboot, which would adapt Resident Evil 1 and 2, with the director saying, "I really wanted to go back to the original first two games, and recreate the terrifying, visceral experience I had when I first played them, whilst at the same time telling a grounded human story about a small, dying American town that feels both relatable and relevant to today's audiences." Over the next 2 years, Roberts' script would be rewritten multiple times as the budget was slashed from $40 million to $25 million, forcing many expensive set pieces and creatures cut from the film, even after production was far enough along for concept art to be created, including hunters, chimeras, crimson heads, giant spiders, Neptune, and Mr. X. And you can absolutely tell these monsters are missing because whoo boy is this movie boring. Welcome to Raccoon City makes some specific changes to try and meld its two stories by starting with young Chris and Claire as children in the RC orphanage, which is run by William Birkin, and Lisa Trevor is also here just kinda chillin', before cutting to September 30th, 1998, as Claire comes to town to investigate Umbrella slowly poisoning the citizens. And we can quickly tell that the budget is tight because Umbrella is leaving and has turned RC into a ghost town. Who is Umbrella? Don't know. Don't see him. Who lives in Raccoon City? Don't know. Don't really see him. This place is a shithole. Soon enough, the people slowly poisoned turn into fast, sometimes talking zombies. And our narrative is split between Jill, Chris, Wesker, and team going to the mansion, and Claire and Leon trying to survive in the besieged police department. I will say that the recreations of iconic game locations like the RPD and the mansion are pretty faithful, and have some good mood given by the cinematography. The movie is also stuffed full of game Easter eggs, some subtle, like the ad for first aid spray, and others shoved in your face, like the lady writing Itchy Tasty in blood. I got it, thanks. A lot of this movie is trying to faithfully recreate specific moments or looks or locations from the game, like the first zombie reveal, or playing Moonlight Sonata to unlock a secret door. But none of these characters are interesting. The movie does nothing for them besides telling us we should care about them because they were in the games. Leon's arc is that he's a fucking idiot and everybody hates him. And Leon thinks he's an idiot too. And I'm sorry, but it takes 50 minutes for both the RE1 and RE2 stories to start here. So what the hell? Welcome to Raccoon City leans much more into the horror of the original game. But there's just one problem. This movie isn't scary. Lisa Trevor fights a licker and kills it, then pieces out of this movie. But why am I supposed to care about Lisa Trevor in this world? The mansion shit is so fucking boring, god dang. Every character here is kind of a panicky idiot except for Claire, but she gets punked by Birkin, even though she should have been the one to kill him. G-Monster Birkin looks like ass and sucks it too, and the movie really shows its lack of budget in the final act, when the zombie hordes are only hinted at, and the CG used for scenes starts to look real flat. In the end, Umbrella has an underground explosion sink RC into the earth, and I guess it looks kinda, what's with the flying cow? Well, our heroes and Sherry make it out alive, and in a Marvel-style post-credits scene, Wesker is alive again, meets Ada, and gets sunglasses. What the fuck? Welcome to Raccoon City, that's a terrible title, is competently made, but the movie thinks its game homages can make up for some really empty characters and shallow narrative. Adaptations will always draw direct comparisons to source material, and it's easy to judge an adaptation based on how closely it mirrors the original. People get hung up on details, like if a character has the exact motivation or the events happen in the same order. Ultimately, I don't think that's important in evaluating an adaptation. What's important is that the adaptation actually works in the new medium that it's adapted to. We already know that Resident Evil works as a video game, both in its more horror-focused entries and its action-focused numbers. But does the story of Resident Evil at its core, you know, STAR's team trapped in a deadly mansion, people trying to survive the Raccoon City outbreak, work as a movie that you sit and watch but don't participate in? I think that it could. If you focused on one of these stories, fleshed out the characters, created a truly scary atmosphere, and even had some real commentary with Umbrella. This is not it. Welcome to Raccoon City made a very disappointing $42 million when released in November of 2021. That's a huge come down from Anderson's movies, with the COVID pandemic hurting most movies released at the time. And while Roberts had expressed interest in sequels that would adapt Code Veronica, 4, 7, and Village, maybe even all at once, fuck it, right? Nothing has been announced. Development on Welcome to Raccoon City was part of a larger push by Capcom to bring RE back to prominence, with the company and Konstantin licensing the series to Netflix for the animated limited series Infinite Darkness and the new live-action TV series, simply titled Resident Evil.
They said the world would end in 2036, but they were wrong. The world ended a long time ago.
Developed by Andrew Dabb and debuting on July 14th, 2022, Netflix's Resident Evil ran for 8 episodes and splits its story between 2 time periods, 2022 in New Raccoon City and 2036 in a post-apocalyptic world, starring Jade and Billy Wesker and their dad, Al. Look, I'm not going to spend too much time here on the Netflix series, but in a history of very strange adaptations, Netflix RE is easily the weirdest take on the material yet. It's at once a sequel to some of the games, with the Raccoon City outbreak and bombing referenced, as well as Wesker apparently having been killed in RE5. But nothing else is said. The zombies of Netflix RE are called Zeros, which aren't undead but instead completely changed animalistic people. But there's also giant animals and liquors. Eventually, we find out that Wesker is one of the 3 clones of the original superhuman villain, and his daughters were created to use their blood to stabilize his condition. But their investigation into Umbrella led to an outbreak that destroyed the world. In the future, the 2 sisters find themselves as enemies amongst different warring factions and the search to stop the Zeros. Questions like, who is this show for? And why did they greenlight this story? And do I really have to watch all of this? abound. In classic Netflix fashion, most of this season is teasing out a mystery and spending most of its varying episode runtimes spreading out very little actual story, before ending on a cliffhanger. Ultimately, Resident Evil was cancelled by Netflix after its first season, despite being pretty popular on the site after its release, because Netflix's shows cost too much money and its revenue model is broken. And with the simultaneous failure of Welcome to Raccoon City and Netflix RE, the live-action adaptation history of Resident Evil came to an abrupt, strange, disappointing stop, with nothing on the horizon at the time of this video's publication. What comes next? Who knows? And as I do with every retrospective, here's my ranking of every Resident Evil live-action movie, from worst to best. At 7, Welcome to Raccoon City. Welcome to Raccoon City starts off promising, with some nice creepy atmosphere and the promise we'll get some of those iconic moments featuring the characters game fans have loved for decades. And as the movie goes along and basically does nothing for half of its 90-minute runtime, you start to realize that this will be the most disappointing movie in this franchise. Smashing two stories together and giving neither of them the amount of time or budget they need to be interesting in film form means that by the time you get to the extremely underwhelming finale that adapts RE2's Birkin fight, you just want this to end already. There needs to be something to actually make me care about these characters and these stories in movie form, besides being able to point at the screen and say, I know what that is. The fact that this was the chance for these movies to do a true adaptation makes it even more disappointing. I won't put the Netflix show on this list because it's strange to compare TV and movies, but I guess you could put it slightly higher than Welcome. At 6, Resident Evil Apocalypse. As the closest adaptation of any of Anderson's movies, Apocalypse is trying to both give game fans the moments they expect from RE3, but also tell its own wire-fu action story starring Alice. The result is a movie that doesn't really satisfy either, and I think it highlights the general difficulty with video game adaptations. If you can't play out the moments that give these stories and characters meaning, why should you want to watch them in a subpar story? Apocalypse is split between being a dark and spooky survival story in a city of the dead, and a really insane action extravaganza led by an Alice that suddenly has super T-virus powers. The movie works best when it's quiet and scary, but that isn't very often. And that crazy action is marred by subpar directing. Although maybe this is a contradiction, but Jovovich is actually really good at being the centerpiece of all that action. It's just that other movies in this series would serve her skills better. At 5, Resident Evil: The Final Chapter. A solid finale that's working to give a greater meaning to the stories that came before. I wish this movie had a unique visual identity like every previous entry, but instead opts for burnt-out post-apocalypse, which makes sense in the context of the film, but isn't that interesting to look at. Still, Anderson shoots every action scene well, somehow making his microsecond fast-cutting legible, while Jovovich is given more character to work with, as Alice's past is retconned into something that, while kinda nonsensical, works to be a story about family, womanhood, reparenting, and self-identification. If this movie hadn't just skipped over the giant battle promised by Retribution, and had kept the previous film's characters instead of swapping them out for a bunch of anonymous red shirts, it would have been better. Still, I like Alice, and in the end, Anderson and Jovovich's movies aren't about Resident Evil. They're about our heroine. At 4, Resident Evil: Extinction. Easily the best pure zombie movie in the franchise. The wild decision of devastating the entire world turns this into a Mad Max adventure, just with a lot more zombies and a splash of telekinesis. It's also got a lot stronger grip on action with some very well done set pieces, thanks to Mulcahy, who makes insanity like the zombie crow attack work way better than it should. I don't think the finale is as good as the desert mayhem that came before, so that knocks it down this list a little. Jovovich continues to be a strong action lead, at the center of wild choreography and looking great doing it. And the ensemble cast is okay, but best for giving this movie a high body count, complete with some great gore and makeup. When someone dies or a zombie is killed, it makes an impact. At 3, Resident Evil. I think this movie's really fun, full of that early 2000s style, powered by techno horror, nu metal all over the soundtrack, and random bits of kung fu to blend with your standard zombie horror. As a single movie, it also works pretty well as a semi-prequel to the original game, with a greater emphasis on corporate secrets and espionage. If someone ever tells you that Paul W.S. Anderson is a forgettable director, they're wrong. Whether or not you like his style, this is his movie through and through, with the line from Event Horizon to this being extremely clear. I also think that Milla Jovovich is a great action lead already, even when dealing with some pretty stiff writing and not much characterization. Having the Umbrella team wiped out and then revealing her to be the hero is a great little arc. And I love that final train showdown against the Licker. Is it a great Resident Evil story? No, but I still have a good time with it all these years later. At 2, Resident Evil Retribution. This movie honks. Super stylish, part Westworld, part aliens, and given a sterile corporate gleam in the underbelly of Umbrella. I think this movie is loads of fun and leans hard into Anderson's maximalist approach. This is probably Alice's strongest story, and the movie that pits her humanity against the weapon that Umbrella turned her into, ultimately choosing to be a mother to a young girl that needs her, giving meaning to a fiction that a corporation deems meaningless. Retribution is a little too heavily reliant on CGI that isn't always there 100%, and focuses too much on the game characters that have been imported into the series, without the stories that make them special. Still, I think the layers added to Alice and her role as a surrogate mother are great. If you vibe with Anderson's style, you'll dig this. And at number 1, Resident Evil Afterlife. After a somewhat rough opening, Afterlife settles into a much more low-key and even sometimes somber story, complete with a muted color palette and tense atmosphere. Slowly, Anderson's movie turns up the bombast, with tons of slow-mo and some wild action sequences, with the bathroom fight against the Axeman being the highlight. Ali Larter's Claire works as a good secondary lead, and, in a series that puts women at the center of the story, benefits the most from Anderson's focus outside of Alice. There's a sense of desperation here that balances the really flashy combat, and it helps the movie feel like more than just an action fest. To me, it's the best of what Anderson's movies can be. Also, this movie's finale features Alice, Claire, and Chris fighting a T-Virus-empowered Wesker, while the Renholder remix of A Perfect Circle's The Outsider plays. So yeah, it's the best movie ever. Now, with Anderson's series done, and 2 very different reboots of Resident Evil both failing, it seems like this game's adaptations have hit a huge bump in the road. And while all those years of Anderson and Jovovich taking the franchise in a very different direction made game fans demand a new version, I think it's been a real example of being careful what you wish for. I think some of Anderson's movies are awesome, stylish, entertaining, with a distinct approach, and increasingly personal. Will there be future Resident Evil adaptations? I'm sure they'll come at some point. But for now, the concepts used for these versions have been completely wrung dry. There came a time when Resident Evil, the video game, had to move on from Umbrella, Raccoon City, and zombies to succeed again. Maybe someday, these movies will learn that lesson too. Thanks for watching today's video, and happy Residecember Evil. This is the 4th video this month in my continuing coverage of all things RE. And when you're talking about Resident Evil, you can't avoid this strange and also really successful side of the franchise. I know there's a lot of fans that don't like the RE movies, especially when it comes to how faithfully, or really not faithfully, they adapted the games over the years. But now that we've reached the end of the video, you can see that I'm a pretty big fan of quite a few of these movies. The original Resident Evil and Apocalypse actually helped get me into the series years ago, and then of course the games have taken me the rest of the way. In the time since, I've been off and on with watching these live-action adaptations, but I've liked some more than others. And on rewatching all of these for this retrospective, I found that I was actually a lot more positive on them than I expected to be, with my view of Afterlife and Retribution in particular going way up. Anderson obviously is a writer and director who is style above substance, but I really enjoy his style. And Jovovich, besides being a crush for me when I was a teenager, is actually a really fun action heroine. And so I think her partnership with Anderson obviously puts her front and center in all these movies, as well as other collaborations they've done. But she works really well for what these movies are trying to do. Not everything works, and even in the best movies in the series, there's some really clunky moments. But personally, when I'm on board with them, I'm really on board. They're really fun. Welcome to Raccoon City, on the other hand, as well as the Netflix series, are really not good. And Welcome to Raccoon City in particular is such a disappointment. Like, this is finally your chance to give fans their live-action video game adaptation of the first 2 games, and you really blow it. Like, really blow it. I really don't think they should have combined those 2 games into one movie. There is absolutely no room for either of those stories to grow on screen. And now we've kind of squandered both of those stories for another adaptation. So maybe in the future they'll do Nemesis, but again, that was already done in Apocalypse. So what I think maybe is best is for a future live-action adaptation to skip directly to 4, or maybe even 7, because those games were really good resets, and you can take them on their own and not worry about the past stories. And they also get away from zombies, which I think this series really needs to do to succeed as a movie. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on all these different RE movies, what you think about me being surprisingly positive about them, what your favorites are, and what you'd actually like to see in a future live-action Resident Evil adaptation. As I've said in previous videos, so much of the music you hear here is by Mono Memory, an awesome musician who specializes in remixes of Resident Evil along with a lot of other music that he does. So a special thank you to Mono Memory, and please go check them out in the links below. If you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video, as well as Patreon exclusive reviews. And for Residecember Evil, I'm doing an exclusive review every week, with reviews including Resident Evil 7 and Lucio Fulci's Zombie 2, so go check that out if you're interested. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and maybe giving another one of these movies a second chance. Happy Residecember Evil!